look, it's almost certainly the case that the number of massacres that are reported, and you can have massacre maps of Australia, literally sort of hundreds of dots around them of massacres. It's almost certainly the case that a lot of those either never happened, or though the numbers killed in them are far less than what is commonly said. So one example of a very famous massacre, or alleged massacre that took place in Van Diemen's Land in 1804 was the Risdon Cove massacre. Risdon Cove is not far from Hobart, and it's where the settlers and the soldiers originally settled before they went to Hobart. Anyhow, one day a cannon shot was heard in Hobart from Risdon Cove. And what happened? Well, the very same day, the minister in the area, Robert Nopwood, who wrote a diary, which is still to this day you can buy, he received a letter from the surgeon in Risdon Cove telling him what had happened. And the surgeon basically said, and this is corroborated by another letter from William Moore, a general at the time, who was sort of in command of the situation, basically that an Aboriginal tribe who saw that some settlers had gone kangaroo hunting and took some kangaroos, seemed either to attack or threaten those settlers and take one of their kangaroos. And then a little bit later, apparently hundreds of Aborigines came and surrounded the settlers with spears and acting in a very, very aggressive manner. Long story short, the surgeon, who's really got no skin in the game because he didn't participate in this particular event, and the general who did, both said, the surgeon said three Aborigines were killed. The police general, William Moore, said 2. Now, so these are the earliest documents that we have of what happened. Eyewitness accounts from the day giving numbers roughly of how many were killed. If you read about it in a book today, they'll say 40 to 50 Aborigines were killed. Where did they get that number from? Because it's not in any of the original accounts. Where they get that from is that 26 years later, a person gave evidence, I think in New South Wales, to an inquiry into Aboriginal violence. A person who was 12 years old at the time of the Risdon Cove event, who wasn't even in Risdon Cove, said 26 years later, around about 40 to 50 were killed. Now, at the time, the inquiry pretty much sort of dismissed his evidence. They didn't dismiss it, but they clearly weren't that impressed with him as a witness. They didn't consider him a particularly reliable witness. And it would seem that somehow or other, the story of that particular event got embellished over the years and the numbers rose to 40 or 50. Reverend Nopwood himself visited the site about a week later, and in the rest of his diary, he never mentions anything about greater numbers than the ones that were reported to him. Now, what have historians done? Historians have basically adopted that figure that first comes up 26 years later from someone who wasn't even there to see the massacre. They've adopted that and they've dismissed the earlier account. That is not how a court of law would work. That is not how a proper journalist would work. But unfortunately, it's how too many historians have operated. They've sort of taken this methodology of almost believe every massacre story. If there's a higher number, generally go for the higher number, not the lower number. Don't subject oral history to too much scrutiny. And what you wind up with is massacre accounts that often are quite just intrinsically implausible in themselves. And this leads to a very misleading reading of Australian history, that it was just wall-to-wall massacres all around Australia. No one doubts that there were massacres. The question is how many there were and how many people died in those that occurred. And on this issue, the best book that you can read is The Fabrication of Aboriginal History by Keith Windschuttle, which came out about 2002. And he scrutinizes all the massacre accounts in Tasmania, and he shows very, very convincingly that the numbers suggested for those who died in massacres is actually grossly inflated, owing to a misreading of records, on occasions just making up numbers, and in actual fact, he shows that they were almost certainly much, much lower.